September 1644. Scotland is burning. The English Civil War has spilled across the border, and the nation has fractured into brutal factional warfare. In the midst of this chaos, one man is about to accomplish something extraordinary. James Graham, Marquis of Montrose, will command in 7 major battles over the next year. He'll face armies twice, sometimes 3 times his size. He'll fight through Highland glens, across winter mountains, in towns and on open moors. And he will not lose, not once. 7 battles, 7 victories, against impossible odds. This is the story of how a Scottish nobleman with no army became the most feared general in Britain, how Highland clansmen and Irish soldiers defeated every force sent against them, and how tactical genius can win battles but not wars. Because Montrose's campaign of 1644-45 is a masterclass in victory and a tragedy in defeat. If you're fascinated by military history, where the underdog defies every expectation, hit that like button and subscribe, because this story will change how you think about what's possible in warfare. Scotland in 1644 wasn't just another battleground in the English Civil War. It was the powder keg that ignited the entire conflict. 6 years earlier, in 1638, Scottish Presbyterians had signed the National Covenant, a document rejecting Charles I's attempts to impose Anglican religious practices on Scotland. This wasn't merely theological disagreement. It was a direct challenge to royal authority. The Covenanters raised armies, defeated Charles's forces, and by 1643 had entered into the Solemn League and Covenant with the English Parliament. They sent 18,000 troops south to fight for Parliament against the king, and those Scottish regiments would prove decisive in parliamentary victories. Scotland, to all appearances, belonged to the Covenant cause. James Graham stood at the heart of this movement. As Marquis of Montrose, he was one of Scotland's premier noblemen, educated, articulate, and respected. He'd signed the National Covenant in 1638 and led Covenanter forces in the Bishops' Wars against Charles I. By any reasonable assessment, Montrose should have remained a Covenanter leader throughout the Civil War. But reasonable assessments rarely account for principle clashing with politics. The problem was Archibald Campbell, Marquis of Argyll. Campbell controlled the Covenant movement through a combination of political cunning, military force, and the power of Clan Campbell, the largest and most powerful clan in the Highlands. Argyll wasn't fighting for religious freedom alone. He was building a Campbell empire across Scotland, using Covenant armies to settle old clan feuds and expand his territories. Montrose watched Argyll's machinations with growing disgust. When Argyll began negotiating to effectively make Scotland independent from England under Campbell dominance, Montrose saw not liberation, but tyranny wearing a different mask. In 1643, Montrose made the decision that would define his life. He would support King Charles I against the Covenant. Not because he'd abandoned his religious convictions, Montrose remained Presbyterian, but because he believed Argyll represented a greater threat to Scottish liberty than the king ever had. It was a spectacularly unpopular position. Most Scots viewed Charles as an enemy of their faith. Montrose was now supporting the king whilst maintaining his opposition to Anglican religious policies, a nuanced position that satisfied almost nobody. Charles I, desperate for any advantage, granted Montrose a commission in February 1644 as Lieutenant Governor and Captain General of Scotland. It was an impressive title attached to an impossible mission: raise a royalist rebellion in a country controlled by Covenant armies. Montrose had no troops, no supplies, and virtually no supporters willing to openly declare for the king. The Covenant controlled every major town, commanded the government, and had popular support across the lowlands. Covenanter armies were fighting in England, but Scotland itself bristled with militia and local forces loyal to Argyll. Montrose spent months trying to coordinate with royalist forces in England, attempting to secure troops and supplies. Every plan collapsed. By August 1644, he crossed into Scotland with exactly 2 companions, his nephew and 1 servant. This wasn't a military expedition. It was desperation masquerading as strategy. Then fortune turned. In the Highlands, a force of 1,500 Irish troops had landed weeks earlier under Auldearn MacColla, a Highland warrior whose family had been dispossessed by the Campbells. MacColla's Irish soldiers were Catholics fighting for the royalist cause, but their real motivation was simpler. They despised Clan Campbell with ancestral fury. When Montrose met MacColla in the Atholl Highlands, he gained not just troops, but a weapon. Experienced soldiers who knew Highland warfare and possessed the ferocity born of generations of blood feuds. Highland clansmen began joining this improbable army. Not in massive numbers, Montrose would never command more than 5,000 troops simultaneously, but enough to create a fighting force. These weren't professional soldiers in the English sense. Highland warriors fought in their traditional manner, a devastating charge with broadsword and tarred shield, relying on speed and terror rather than sustained combat. MacColla's Irish troops provided the disciplined centre, professional soldiers who could fight in formation with pike and musket. Together, they represented something the Covenant forces hadn't prepared for. An army that combined conventional military discipline with Highland clan warfare. The strategic situation appeared hopeless. Scotland's military strength was deployed in England, true, but the forces remaining in Scotland still outnumbered anything Montrose could assemble. Every major town opposed him. The Lowlands, where most of Scotland's population and wealth concentrated, supported the Covenant. Montrose commanded barbarian raiders, not a proper army. Conventional military wisdom said he should retreat to the Highlands, conduct guerrilla warfare, and hope for reinforcements from England that would never arrive. Montrose rejected conventional wisdom entirely. In late August 1644, he marched on Perth. The Covenant authorities, shocked that this ragged force dared challenge them openly, assembled an army to crush the rebellion before it could spread. They outnumbered Montrose 2-1 and possessed superior equipment, artillery, and training. They expected an easy victory that would end this foolish royalist adventure within days. They were about to discover that numbers don't win battles. Tactics do. And James Graham was about to demonstrate tactical brilliance that would echo through military history. The campaign was beginning, and Scotland's fate hung in the balance. What happened next at Tippermuir would shock the Covenant leadership and announce to Scotland that something unprecedented had arrived in their midst. A general who understood that audacity, properly applied, defeats caution every time. On the 1st of September, 1644, Montrose's army approached Perth from the west. Intelligence reports confirmed what he already suspected. A Covenant army under Lord Elcho was marching to intercept him. The numbers were grim. Montrose commanded approximately 3,000 men, MacColla's 1,500 Irish, Highland clansmen from various clans, and some lowland royalist volunteers. Many lacked proper weapons. Some carried only agricultural implements. Against them, Elcho deployed between 6,000 and 7,000 troops, well armed with muskets and pikes, supported by cavalry and artillery. By every military principle, Montrose should have avoided battle, retreated to defensible ground, or attempted to outmaneuver the enemy. Instead, he marched directly toward them. The armies met at Tippermuir, open moorland west of Perth, where neither side possessed terrain advantage. Elcho positioned his forces in conventional formation: infantry centre, cavalry on the flanks, artillery forward. His troops were militia rather than veterans, but they outnumbered the royalists substantially and held superior firepower. Covenant commanders watched Montrose's ragged army approach and saw victory before the battle began. Montrose arranged his forces in a way that would become his signature. MacColla's Irish infantry formed the centre, disciplined troops who could maintain formation under fire. Highland clansmen took the wings, positioned for the charge they'd trained for since childhood. There was no artillery. The cavalry numbered perhaps 40 horsemen, an afterthought compared to Elcho's mounted force. What Montrose possessed was understanding of how Highland warfare worked and willingness to embrace it fully. The battle began with Covenant artillery fire. Cannonballs tore through Montrose's ranks, but the lines held. Musket fire followed as the armies closed distance. At 200 yards, the Covenant front rank fired a volley. Montrose's troops kept advancing. At 100 yards, Highland warriors on the flanks broke into a run. The Irish centre maintained steady advance. At 50 yards, McCullough's troops fired their single volley. Every musket discharged simultaneously, then dropped their firearms and drew swords. What happened next terrified Covenant soldiers who'd never faced Highland tactics. 3,000 screaming warriors charged at full sprint, broadswords raised, targes deflecting musket fire. The Covenant troops had time for perhaps one more volley before the Highland line crashed into them. Swords against pikes in close combat isn't a fair contest when one side has momentum and the other is standing still. The Covenant centre shattered within minutes. Their cavalry attempted to flank, but found Highland warriors already surging around the broken infantry, and cavalry cannot manoeuvre effectively against scattered, fast-moving swordsmen. The battle became a rout. Covenant soldiers fled toward Perth with Montrose's Highlanders pursuing. By day's end, 2,000 Covenant troops lay dead on the moor. Montrose had lost perhaps a dozen men. It wasn't just a victory. It was annihilation. Perth surrendered without further resistance. The Covenant garrison abandoned the city. Montrose's impossible army had won its first battle through tactics that conventional military wisdom considered primitive. But Tippermuir taught Montrose something crucial. The Highland charge worked brilliantly, once. Getting men to fight a second battle proved harder. Highland warriors viewed warfare as raiding, not campaigning. They'd won their battle, taken plunder from Perth, and many simply went home. This would plague Montrose throughout the entire campaign. His army wasn't a standing force, but a temporary coalition that required constant recruitment and suffered constant desertion. Still, victory brought recruits. Royalist sympathizers who'd hidden their allegiance now joined openly. By mid-September, Montrose had rebuilt his forces and faced a new problem. What next? The Covenant controlled Edinburgh, Glasgow, and every other major centre. Argyll was mobilising the full power of Clan Campbell. Montrose needed another victory, something that would prove Tippermuir wasn't a fluke. He marched northeast toward Aberdeen, Scotland's third largest city and a Covenant stronghold. The city garrison numbered approximately 2,500 troops under experienced commanders. They had time to prepare defences and knew Montrose was coming. Aberdeen's magistrates sent desperate messages to Edinburgh requesting reinforcements, but help wouldn't arrive in time. On the 13th of September, Montrose's army appeared outside the city walls. Aberdeen presented different challenges than Tippermuir's open moor. Urban warfare negated the Highland charge advantage. Defenders could use buildings for cover, narrow streets to channel attackers, and city walls to break up assaults. The Covenant garrison refused to meet Montrose in open battle. They'd learned that lesson from Tippermuir. Instead, they forced him to attack prepared positions. Montrose divided his forces and attacked from multiple directions simultaneously. McCullough led the Irish troops against the main defences, whilst Highland contingents probed for weak points in the city's perimeter. The fighting was vicious, house to house, street by street. Covenant defenders made Montrose's troops pay for every advance. But coordinated pressure from multiple directions prevented the defenders from concentrating their forces effectively. By afternoon, Royalist troops had breached the inner defences, and fighting raged throughout Aberdeen's centre. When organised resistance collapsed, discipline collapsed with it. For 3 days, Montrose's army sacked Aberdeen. Buildings burned. Citizens were killed. The looting was systematic and brutal. Montrose later claimed he'd lost control of his troops, particularly the Irish contingent who'd been promised plunder as payment. Whether he genuinely couldn't stop it or chose not to remains debated, but the sack of Aberdeen stained his reputation permanently. Covenant propaganda seized on the atrocity as proof that Montrose commanded barbarians, not soldiers. The strategic consequences cut both ways. Aberdeen was secured, and northeastern Scotland fell under Royalist control. But the brutality alienated potential supporters across the lowlands. Montrose needed lowland nobles and their tenants to join his cause, yet Aberdeen demonstrated that his army brought destruction, not liberation. The contradiction would haunt him. He could win battles magnificently, but couldn't transform military victories into stable political support. Nonetheless, 2 major victories in 2 weeks announced that Montrose was a genuine threat. In Edinburgh, the Covenant government recognised they faced not a minor rebellion, but a military crisis. Argyll personally took command of forces being assembled to destroy Montrose. The Campbell chief commanded resources vastly superior to anything Montrose possessed: more troops, better supplies, political authority, and the wealth of Scotland's most powerful clan. Argyll intended to end this rebellion through overwhelming force. Montrose understood what was coming. He'd won 2 battles through tactical surprise and Highland ferocity, but Argyll wouldn't make the same mistakes as Elcho. The Campbell chief was no military genius, but he was competent and commanded quality troops. When Argyll's army caught Montrose, the numerical disparity would be crushing. Worse, autumn was advancing toward winter. Highland warriors would soon abandon the campaign to return home for harvest and preparation for winter. Montrose's window for campaigning was closing rapidly. Yet retreating to the Highlands meant conceding the lowlands and waiting passively whilst Covenant forces consolidated. Montrose needed to maintain momentum, keep winning, and hope that continuous victories would force the Covenant to negotiate or fracture their political unity. It was a strategy built on optimism and audacity rather than resources and logistics. Against a competent opponent with superior forces, it should have failed quickly. By late October 1644, Argyll had assembled an army of over 4,000 troops and was hunting Montrose through Aberdeenshire. The Campbell chief possessed cavalry, artillery, and experienced infantry. Montrose's forces had dwindled to roughly 2,000 men as Highlanders drifted home with their plunder. The strategic situation was deteriorating rapidly. Argyll didn't need to defeat Montrose in pitched battle. He simply needed to corner him and apply overwhelming force. On the 28th of October, Argyll caught up with Montrose near Fyvie Castle in Aberdeenshire. What followed wasn't a single battle, but 3 days of running combat that tested Montrose's tactical flexibility in ways Tippermuir and Aberdeen hadn't. Argyll commanded the initiative. His larger force could choose when and where to engage. Montrose was forced into defensive positions, fighting to protect his supply train and maintain an escape route. The fighting around Fyvie demonstrated something crucial about Montrose's generalship. He was as skilled in defence as attack. When Argyll's forces advanced on the 28th, Montrose positioned his troops on rising ground, with flanks anchored by ravines. Highland warriors held the centre, whilst MacColla's Irish troops formed a mobile reserve. Argyll attacked, but couldn't break the royalist positions. Casualties mounted on both sides without decisive result. The 29th brought renewed Covenant assaults. Argyll probed different sectors, attempting to find weakness in Montrose's line. Each attack was repulsed, but Montrose recognised the mathematics working against him. He was outnumbered 2-1, running low on ammunition, and couldn't afford the casualties that defensive fighting inflicted. Argyll could retreat, resupply, and attack again. Montrose had no such options. On the 30th of October, Montrose executed a fighting withdrawal under contact with the enemy, one of warfare's most dangerous manoeuvres. His troops disengaged by sections, each unit covering the others whilst falling back toward more defensible positions. Argyll pursued but cautiously, unwilling to risk a trap. By nightfall, Montrose had extracted his army intact and broken contact. Argyll claimed victory because Montrose retreated. Montrose claimed victory because his outnumbered force had held off Argyll for 3 days and escaped destruction. Technically, Fyvie wasn't a defeat. Montrose achieved his tactical objective of preserving his army, but it revealed his vulnerability. Against a competent commander with superior numbers, Montrose couldn't win decisively. He could only survive. And survival wasn't enough to win a war. Winter was arriving, and with it came Montrose's recurring nightmare: mass desertion. Highland clansmen viewed warfare as seasonal activity. Winter meant returning home to protect livestock, repair buildings, and survive the harsh Scottish climate. By November, Montrose's army had shrunk to barely 1,500 men, mostly MacColla's loyal Irish troops and a corps of committed Highlanders. Covenant forces controlled the lowlands. Argyll commanded the Highlands through Campbell power. Montrose held nothing but a ragged army in mountains that were becoming impassable. Any reasonable general would have retreated to secure winter quarters, dispersed his forces to reduce supply demands, and waited for spring. Montrose considered the strategic picture and decided on something entirely unreasonable. He would attack Argyll in the heart of Campbell territory during winter. Argyll had retired to his stronghold at Inverlochy on Loch Fyne, confident that winter made campaigning impossible. Campbell lands stretched across the Western Highlands, protected by terrain that few armies could traverse even in summer. The Great Glen, a geological fault line cutting through the Highlands, presented a natural barrier that conventional military forces considered impassable in winter. Mountains rose thousands of feet on either side, snow-covered and treacherous. Argyll positioned troops to watch the few passable routes and settled in to wait for spring. Montrose studied maps and made a decision that would cement his reputation for audacity. He would march through the mountains in the dead of winter, emerge where Argyll thought no army could appear, and strike before the Campbell chief could react. It was strategically brilliant and logistically insane. In late January 1645, Montrose's army began one of the most remarkable forced marches in British military history. 1,500 men moved up the Great Glen in the depths of winter, then turned west into the mountains. They carried minimal supplies because heavy baggage trains couldn't traverse the terrain. They wore Highland dress that provided inadequate protection against freezing temperatures. They marched through snowdrifts, over ice-covered slopes, across rivers swollen with winter melt. Men died from exposure. Others suffered frostbite. The army subsisted on whatever they could forage or carry. Argyll received reports of royalist troops moving up the Great Glen, but dismissed them as routine reconnaissance. When further reports claimed Montrose was attempting a mountain crossing, Argyll declared it impossible and ignored the intelligence. No army could cross those mountains in winter. It was a physical impossibility. On the 1st of February, Montrose's army descended from the mountains above Inverlochy. They'd marched over 30 miles through terrain that shouldn't have been passable, emerged exactly where Argyll thought impossible, and were positioned to attack the Campbell heartland with complete tactical surprise. Argyll panicked. His main force was dispersed across winter quarters. The troops immediately available numbered roughly 3,000. Commanded by his cousin Duncan Campbell, while Argyll himself was at Inverlochy Castle. On the 2nd of February, Argyll made a decision that would haunt his reputation forever. He boarded a ship in Loch Linnhe and sailed away from the battle. His official reason was illness. His enemies called it cowardice. Whatever the motivation, Argyll abandoned his army before the fighting began. The Battle of Inverlochy was slaughter. Campbell forces formed up on the shore of Loch Linnhe, near the ruins of Inverlochy Castle. They outnumbered Montrose's exhausted troops 2-1. But numbers meant nothing against an army that had just accomplished the impossible and knew their enemy's commander had fled. When Montrose ordered the attack, his 1,500 troops charged with ferocious confidence. The Highland warriors crashed into Campbell lines that were still forming properly. MacColla's Irish troops maintained pressure in the centre, whilst clansmen flanked the Campbell positions. The Campbell army disintegrated within hours. 1,500 Campbell soldiers died on the shore or fleeing through the hills. Some drowned trying to swim Loch Linnhe to escape. The clan that had dominated Highland politics for generations suffered a catastrophic defeat that destroyed their military power and humiliated their chief. Montrose lost perhaps a dozen men. The psychological impact of Inverlochy rippled across Scotland. Montrose had marched through impassable mountains in winter, appeared where no army should exist, defeated a force twice his size, and shattered the most powerful Highland clan. The Covenant government in Edinburgh realised they faced not merely a skilled general, but someone operating beyond conventional military limitations. News of Inverlochy reached King Charles I in Oxford, where royalist fortunes were declining. Charles wrote to Montrose calling him James, "Thou art the greatest of all my subjects." It was recognition that one general in Scotland was achieving what all the king's commanders in England couldn't: consistent, devastating victories against parliamentary forces. But Montrose understood what others didn't. Inverlochy was a tactical masterpiece and strategic irrelevance. He'd destroyed Campbell military power, but the Covenant still controlled the lowlands, the government, and the major cities. Highland victories didn't translate into political control, and spring was coming, which meant Covenant armies would march north in strength that Montrose's depleted forces couldn't match. The campaign had produced 3 astonishing victories, but the war remained unwinnable. Montrose needed to defeat not just armies, but the entire Covenant political structure. And he needed to do it before his army dissolved again, before the Covenanters concentrated overwhelming force, before his impossible winning streak finally met impossible odds. Spring 1645 arrived with Montrose controlling precisely nothing. His victories at Tippermuir, Aberdeen, and Inverlochy had destroyed 3 Covenant armies, but Scotland's government remained firmly in Covenant hands. Edinburgh, Glasgow, Aberdeen, every significant town opposed him. The problem was structural. Highland warriors won battles brilliantly, then went home. Montrose couldn't maintain an army between campaigns. He won victories in weeks, then spent months rebuilding forces that had melted away. The Covenant government recognized this pattern and adapted their strategy. Instead of sending single large armies that Montrose could defeat through tactical brilliance, they mobilized multiple smaller forces simultaneously. If Montrose marched north, Covenant troops would threaten from the south. If he moved east, they'd attack from the west. The strategy aimed to exhaust him through constant movement rather than risk another catastrophic defeat. By April, Montrose had rebuilt his army to approximately 2,000 men. Not enough to besiege major cities or occupy territory, but sufficient for mobile operations. He marched through northeastern Scotland, recruiting and raiding, keeping Covenant forces off balance. Then intelligence arrived. A Covenant army under Sir John Hurry was marching to intercept him near Inverness with 4,000 troops. Hurry was a professional soldier, a Scot who'd fought in European wars before returning to command in the civil conflict. Unlike previous Covenant commanders, he understood mobility and surprise. On the night of the 8th of May, Hurry executed a forced march and appeared at dawn outside the village of Auldearn, where Montrose's forces were encamped. It was the first time an enemy had surprised Montrose rather than the reverse. The situation on the morning of the 9th of May was desperate. Montrose's 2,000 troops were scattered through Auldearn village in quarters, not deployed for battle. Hurry's 4,000 soldiers were forming attack positions, with Montrose's army still organizing. Any other general would have attempted an immediate fighting withdrawal. Montrose saw opportunity in crisis. He sent MacColla with 500 men, primarily Irish infantry, to occupy a position on the northern edge of the village, with orders to hold at all costs and make as much noise as possible. MacColla raised the royal standard, fired sporadic musket volleys, and generally created the impression that the entire royalist army was positioned on that flank. Meanwhile, Montrose took the remaining 1,500 men and formed them in concealed positions to the south. Hurry saw the royal standard and heard the firing from MacColla's position. He concluded that Montrose was deploying his full force on the northern sector and ordered his main attack there. 4,000 Covenant troops advanced against MacColla's 500. The Irish infantry fought with desperate courage, forming tight defensive positions and repelling repeated assaults. They were hideously outnumbered, taking casualties with each Covenant attack wave, but they held. For 2 hours, 500 men absorbed the attention of an army 8 times their size. Montrose waited until Hurry had committed his entire force to the attack on MacColla, then launched his flanking assault from concealment. 1,500 royalist troops crashed into the Covenant army's exposed flank and rear. Hurry's forces were packed together, focused forward, unable to redeploy quickly. The Covenant formations collapsed under attacks from 2 directions. Within an hour, the battle transformed from Covenant assault to Royalist victory. 2,000 Covenant soldiers died. Hurry fled with the survivors. McCullough's Irish troops, battered but intact, had accomplished one of the war's most remarkable holding actions. Auldearn demonstrated Montrose's ability to improvise under pressure. Surprised in camp by superior forces, he'd transformed disadvantage into victory through tactical deception and his subordinates' courage. But the victory came at cost. McCullough's Irish contingent had suffered heavy casualties. These were irreplaceable professional soldiers, not Highland clansmen who could be recruited from local clans. Every dead Irish soldier weakened Montrose's reliable corps. The strategic situation remained fundamentally unchanged. Montrose had destroyed another Covenant army, but others were mobilizing. General William Bailey assembled a new force in the south. Lord Lindsay commanded troops in the east. The Covenant could lose battles repeatedly because they controlled Scotland's political and economic resources. Montrose had to win every battle because a single defeat would end his campaign permanently. By late June, Montrose was marching through Aberdeenshire when intelligence arrived that Bailey had moved north with 2,500 troops. Unlike Hurry's aggressive approach, Bailey was cautious, shadowing Montrose without committing to battle. The two armies manoeuvred through the Don Valley, each commander seeking advantage whilst avoiding unfavourable engagement. Bailey had orders from Edinburgh to avoid pitched battle unless circumstances were overwhelmingly favourable. The Covenant government had finally learned that fighting Montrose in open battle was strategically foolish, regardless of numerical advantage. But Bailey's caution created political problems. The Committee of Estates, the Covenant's governing body, sent increasingly strident orders demanding he attack. Local nobles whose lands Montrose was raiding pressured Bailey to engage. By early July, the political pressure became unsustainable. Bailey, against his military judgment, moved to force battle. On the 2nd of July, the armies converged near Alford on the banks of the River Don. Bailey commanded 2,500 troops, including cavalry and infantry. Montrose had assembled 2,000 men, though several hundred were unreliable recent recruits. The terrain favoured defence. The Don River created a natural obstacle, and hills overlooked the potential battlefield. Montrose positioned his forces on a hill south of the river and waited. Bailey, compelled by his political masters to attack, ordered his army to cross the Don and assault Montrose's position. It was exactly the scenario Montrose wanted: enemy forces attacking uphill after a river crossing, losing formation cohesion in the advance. Bailey's troops forded the river and began climbing the slope. Montrose held his main line stationary, whilst sending cavalry to harass the Covenant flanks. When Bailey's forces were halfway up the hill, formations disrupted by the climb, Montrose ordered the general advance. Highland warriors and Irish infantry charged downhill into troops still struggling upward. The collision was devastating. Covenant formations couldn't maintain cohesion whilst climbing and fighting simultaneously. Their line broke within minutes. The retreat became a rout. Bailey's cavalry fled first, abandoning the infantry. Covenant foot soldiers tried to retreat back across the Don, but were cut down by pursuing Royalists. The battle lasted perhaps 2 hours from first contact to final collapse. Bailey lost his entire army, killed, captured, or scattered. Montrose lost fewer than 100 men. But Alford brought tragedy within victory. Lord George Gordon, a crucial Royalist commander who'd brought Gordon clan support to Montrose, was killed by a musket shot during the pursuit. Gordon's death eliminated one of Montrose's few reliable lowland noble supporters and removed the political influence that had kept the powerful Gordon clan committed to the Royalist cause. Tactically, Alford was another brilliant victory. Politically, it weakened Montrose's already fragile coalition. 4 consecutive victories, Tippermuir, Inverlochy, Auldearn, Alford, established a pattern that military historians still study. Montrose won through consistent tactical principles: position forces for maximum defensive advantage, lure enemies into attacking unfavourable terrain, hold until enemy formations were committed and disrupted, then launch devastating counterattacks at decisive points. He combined Highland warriors' shock charge with Irish infantry's disciplined formation fighting, creating a combined arms approach that exploited each component's strengths. But patterns that win battles don't necessarily win wars. Every victory brought brief recruitment surges, followed by inevitable desertion. Montrose couldn't translate battlefield success into stable territorial control. The lowlands remained hostile. Major cities stayed firmly Covenant, and each destroyed Covenant army was replaced by another, mobilizing from Scotland's substantially larger population and economic base. Still, by mid-July 1645, Montrose's reputation had reached legendary status. 4 major victories in 11 months against consistently superior numbers. Covenant commanders were terrified of facing him. Recruitment to his army increased as success bred confidence. For the first time, significant numbers of lowland gentry began considering whether the royalist cause might actually triumph. The Covenant government recognized the crisis. They needed to destroy Montrose decisively and permanently. One more victory might trigger political collapse of Covenant authority. The government mobilized every available soldier for a final overwhelming effort. They would assemble the largest army yet sent against Montrose, put it under experienced command, and crush the rebellion through sheer numerical superiority that no tactical brilliance could overcome. August 1645 marked the peak of Montrose's campaign. His army had grown to approximately 5,000 troops, the largest force he'd ever commanded. Highlanders from clans across Scotland had joined after hearing of his victories. Lowland nobles who'd remained cautiously neutral now committed their retainers. MacColla's Irish corps remained, supplemented by Scottish infantry willing to fight in disciplined formations. For the first time, Montrose possessed an army that looked like it could hold territory rather than merely raid. The Covenant government responded by mobilizing everything. General William Bailey, who'd escaped Alford with his reputation damaged but his military judgment intact, was given command of a new army. The Committee of Estates stripped garrisons from across Scotland, recalled units from less threatened areas, and assembled between 6,000 and 7,000 troops. They added political commissioners to oversee Bailey's command, nobles who would ensure the general actually fought rather than maneuver cautiously. It was a recipe for disaster, putting political pressure above military judgment, but the Covenant was desperate for decisive victory. The armies converged near Kilsyth, northeast of Glasgow. On the morning of the 15th of August, they faced each other across a valley. Bailey positioned his forces on high ground with the town of Kilsyth behind him. His army was larger, well supplied, and held superior terrain. Montrose deployed opposite with his 5,000 men, studying the enemy positions and calculating options. What happened next reveals as much about Covenant dysfunction as Montrose's brilliance. Bailey wanted to hold his defensive position and force Montrose to attack uphill. The political commissioners overruled him. They ordered an aggressive maneuver, march the army across Montrose's front to seize even higher ground on the royalist flank. It would put Covenant forces in a dominant position from which they could bombard Montrose's army and force retreat. Bailey protested that the maneuver was tactically unsound. Moving an army across an enemy's front exposed the entire force to attack, whilst formations were disrupted by marching. The commissioners insisted. Bailey, his authority undermined by political overseers, obeyed. At mid-morning, the Covenant army began its flanking march. Montrose watched 6,000 enemy troops march across his front with their formations extended and vulnerable. Any competent general would recognize the opportunity. Montrose was more than competent. But he didn't order an immediate general attack. He waited, watching the Covenant column stretch out, judging the exact moment when they'd be most vulnerable. MacColla saw it first. The Covenant army's left flank, the rear of their marching column, was exposed and isolated from the rest of the force. Highland contingents under MacColla's command were positioned directly opposite this vulnerable flank. MacColla, without waiting for Montrose's orders, launched his troops forward. It was technically insubordination, but it was also exactly the right decision at precisely the right moment. 2,000 Highland warriors charged the exposed Covenant flank. The effect was catastrophic. Covenant troops at the rear of the column were facing the wrong direction, marching in column formation rather than battle line, unable to redeploy before the Highland charge crashed into them. Battalions collapsed. Soldiers fled or were cut down. The panic spread forward through the column like fire through dry grass. Montrose saw McCullough's attack succeed and immediately ordered general advance across his entire line. 5,000 Royalist troops surged forward against a Covenant army that had transformed from organised force into confused mass within minutes. Bailey desperately tried to form defensive positions, but his army was strung out in marching column, units were intermixed, and Highland warriors were already deep into his formations. Command and control disappeared. The battle became a rout within an hour of McCullough's initial charge. Covenant soldiers broke and ran toward Kilsyth, toward Glasgow, toward anywhere away from the screaming Highlanders pursuing with drawn swords. Bailey's cavalry fled early, abandoning the infantry. The infantry attempted to surrender, but found Highland warriors in blood fury weren't always accepting surrender. The killing continued through the afternoon as Royalist forces pursued fleeing Covenanters across miles of countryside. By evening, the Covenant army had ceased to exist. 4,000 soldiers lay dead. The survivors were scattered, weaponless fugitives hiding in villages or struggling toward Covenant-held cities. Bailey escaped with perhaps a few hundred cavalry. It was the most complete victory of Montrose's campaign. He destroyed the largest army sent against him through a combination of enemy mistakes and perfect tactical exploitation. The strategic consequences were immediate and dramatic. Glasgow, Scotland's second-largest city, surrendered without resistance 2 days later. Edinburgh's Covenant government prepared to evacuate the capital. Local Covenant authorities across southern Scotland collapsed as officials fled or switched allegiances. For the first time since the campaign began, Montrose controlled actual territory rather than merely raiding through enemy lands. Lowland nobles who'd remained neutral now declared for the king. Recruitment surged. His army swelled toward 10,000 men. Charles I, besieged in Oxford by parliamentary forces, received news of Kilsyth with desperate hope. If Montrose marched south into England with 10,000 troops, it might relieve pressure on the Royalist cause. The king sent urgent messages: consolidate Scotland, then march to join the main Royalist armies. Victory in Scotland could transform the entire civil war. Montrose stood at the pinnacle of success. In exactly 1 year, he'd fought 6 major battles: Tippermuir, Aberdeen, Inverlochy, Auldearn, Alford, Kilsyth, and won them all. He'd defeated every army sent against him, destroyed Covenant military power, and forced Scotland's government to the brink of collapse. Military historians would later marvel at the campaign's consistent brilliance. Poets would celebrate the great Montrose, who accomplished the impossible. But Montrose understood something his admirers didn't. Highland armies were temporary coalitions, not standing forces. His 10,000 troops included perhaps 2,000 reliable soldiers, McCullough's Irish, and a corps of committed Highlanders. The rest were clansmen who'd joined after Kilsyth because victory was assured and plunder was available. They'd already begun drifting away with their loot. Within weeks, Montrose would command 3,000 troops at best. Within months, perhaps half that. He faced a strategic dilemma: march south immediately with whatever forces remained loyal, join Charles I, and hope the combined Royalist armies could defeat Parliament, or consolidate control in Scotland first, build a sustainable political structure, then intervene in England from a position of strength. The first option was bold but risky: marching into England with an army that might dissolve during the campaign. The second was prudent but slow, giving Parliament time to defeat Charles before Montrose could help. Montrose chose consolidation. He would secure Scotland properly, establish Royalist government, ensure his rear was stable before marching south. It was the cautious decision, the strategic decision, and it was catastrophically wrong. Because whilst Montrose recruited and organised in southern Scotland through late August and early September, parliamentary forces in England had achieved decisive victory. At Naseby in June, Parliament's new model army under Fairfax and Cromwell had destroyed the main royalist field army. The King's cause in England was collapsing, and Parliament could now spare troops to deal with the Scottish problem. David Leslie, a professional Scottish soldier commanding Covenant cavalry in England, received orders to return north with 4,000 veteran troops, cavalry and infantry who'd fought at Marston Moor and Naseby, experienced in the disciplined warfare of the English campaigns. Leslie was everything Montrose's previous opponents weren't: cautious, professional, and commanding quality troops rather than militia. By early September, Montrose's swollen army had predictably shrunk. Highland warriors had returned home with their plunder. Lowland recruits, seeing no immediate action, drifted away. The army that had numbered 10,000 in August was down to perhaps 1,500 reliable troops, mostly McCullough's Irish, a few hundred loyal Highlanders, and some cavalry. Montrose was near Selkirk in the Borders, recruiting and attempting to impose royalist authority on a region that had no tradition of loyalty to the crown. His intelligence network, which had served him brilliantly during the Highland campaigns, failed him completely. He didn't know Leslie had returned from England. He didn't know 4,000 veteran Covenant troops were within a day's march. He was camped with forces dispersed for foraging, not concentrated for battle. On the morning of the 13th of September, exactly 1 year after his victory at Aberdeen, David Leslie's cavalry appeared at dawn outside Montrose's camp at Philiphaugh. Montrose's undefeated streak, his year of impossible victories, was about to meet the one enemy that tactical genius couldn't overcome. A competent opponent with overwhelming force, striking with complete surprise. Everything built through 6 victories was about to collapse in a single morning. And this time, there would be no miraculous escape. Dawn on the 13th of September broke grey and cold over Philiphaugh. Montrose's army was scattered across several miles around Selkirk. Some troops billeted in the town, others camping along the Ettrick Water, cavalry picketed separately. It was the dispersed arrangement of an army not expecting immediate combat. Montrose himself was lodging in Selkirk with his senior officers. Intelligence had reported no enemy forces in the region. The assumption was safety, time to recruit and organize before marching south. David Leslie's 4,000 troops had marched through the night and positioned themselves in the pre-dawn darkness. Leslie commanded disciplined cavalry and veteran infantry who'd fought Parliament's battles in England. These weren't militia who'd break at the first Highland charge. They were professional soldiers who understood formation fighting and wouldn't panic under pressure. Leslie deployed them carefully, cavalry in front to exploit surprise, infantry following to secure victory. The attack began at first light. Covenant cavalry thundered into Montrose's scattered positions before most royalist troops had armed themselves properly. Chaos erupted across the encampment. Men stumbled from shelters to find enemy horsemen among them. Units tried to form defensive positions but lacked time to organize effectively. The careful tactical arrangements that had won 6 battles were impossible when the enemy struck before deployment could occur. Montrose reacted with characteristic speed once he grasped what was happening. He sent runners to concentrate forces at a defensive position near the confluence of Ettrick Water and Yarrow Water. McCullough's Irish troops, veterans of every battle in the campaign, formed the core defensive line. They numbered perhaps 500, professional soldiers who could fight in formation even under surprise attack. Highland warriors filtered toward the defensive position in small groups, but many were cut off by Leslie's cavalry or fled immediately. Within an hour, Montrose had approximately 1,500 troops in a rough defensive formation facing 4,000 Covenant veterans. The mathematics were brutal and getting worse. Leslie's forces were concentrated and organized. Montrose's were fragments of units thrown together in crisis. The Irish infantry formed a tight defensive position, pikes outward, ready to receive cavalry charges. But they were surrounded on 3 sides, with the river at their backs. Leslie didn't charge recklessly. He'd studied Montrose's previous battles and understood what happened when enemies attacked Highland positions impulsively. Instead, he deployed his superior numbers systematically. Musketeers advanced to firing range and poured volleys into the packed Irish formations. Artillery unlimbered and began bombardment. Cavalry probed for weaknesses without committing to suicidal charges. It was methodical destruction rather than heroic combat. Montrose's officers urged him to escape, whilst cavalry could still break through Leslie's encirclement. The battle was lost. Staying meant death or capture. Montrose initially refused, unwilling to abandon the troops who'd fought for him through 6 victories. McCulloch physically forced him onto a horse and organised a cavalry breakout. Approximately 100 horsemen charged through Leslie's lines and escaped. Montrose rode with them, looking back at the Irish infantry still fighting desperately against impossible odds. The Irish troops fought with magnificent courage for another hour. Surrounded, outnumbered 4-1, they maintained formation and repelled multiple assaults. But courage can't defeat mathematics. Ammunition ran out. Casualties mounted. The defensive position grew smaller as men fell. Eventually, Covenant forces pressed close enough that maintaining pike formation became impossible. The Irish infantry's cohesion collapsed into individual fights, desperate men with swords against overwhelming numbers. When organised resistance ended, approximately 300 Irish soldiers surrendered. They'd been promised quarter, the military convention that troops who surrendered would be spared. Leslie's officers began assembling the prisoners. Then the Covenant political commissioners arrived, the same type of officials who'd overruled Bailey at Kilsyth. They ordered immediate execution of all Irish prisoners on grounds that they were Catholic rebels, not legitimate soldiers. The massacre that followed was systematic. 300 men who'd surrendered under promise of quarter were executed in groups. Some were shot, others hanged, many simply killed with swords. Camp followers who'd accompanied the Irish troops, wives, servants, civilians, were murdered alongside the soldiers. Covenant officers who protested were overruled. The killing continued through the afternoon. It was the ugliest atrocity of Scotland's civil war, and it permanently stained the Covenant's reputation even amongst its supporters. Montrose escaped, but commanded virtually nothing. His army was destroyed. McCulloch fled separately with a handful of survivors. The Royalist coalition that had won 6 consecutive battles disintegrated within a single day. Montrose attempted to rebuild through the autumn of 1645, raising small forces and fighting minor actions, but the campaign's momentum was shattered. Highland clans who joined after Kilsyth now refused to commit troops. Lowland nobles withdrew support. By winter, Montrose commanded scattered bands rather than an army. The strategic consequences extended beyond Scotland. Charles I had pinned hopes on Montrose's campaign, relieving pressure on the Royalist cause. Philiphaugh eliminated that possibility. Parliament's victory in England became irreversible. Within months, Charles would surrender to Scottish Covenant forces, beginning the sequence of events leading to his trial and execution. Montrose's defeat hadn't just ended his campaign, it had sealed the king's fate. But here's the crucial question. Did Philiphaugh actually break Montrose's undefeated record? Technically, he'd been surprised and forced to retreat, but he'd extracted himself and part of his army. The Irish troops under McCulloch's immediate command had been destroyed, but they'd fought as an independent force that morning. Military historians debate whether Philiphaugh counts as Montrose's defeat, or McCulloch's, or simply as a successful ambush rather than a true battle. What's undeniable is that Philiphaugh destroyed what Montrose had built. The campaign that began at Tippermuir in September 1644 effectively ended at Philiphaugh in September 1645. Montrose fought minor actions afterward. Small victories that demonstrated his tactical skills hadn't diminished, but he never again commanded forces sufficient for strategic impact. The year of victories was over. Montrose eventually fled Scotland in 1646, went into exile on the continent, and attempted a return in 1650 with a small force of foreign mercenaries. At Carbisdale, a minor action in northern Scotland, his tiny army was destroyed by Covenant militia. He was captured, taken to Edinburgh, and executed on the 21st of May, 1650. The Covenant government hanged him as a traitor, then dismembered his body and displayed the parts across Scotland as warning. It was brutal treatment for a man who'd once been Scotland's most celebrated general. His final words on the scaffold reflected his character. "I pray God that I may never die in a good cause, but I pray God that I may always die for a good cause." Whether his cause was genuinely good remains debated. What's certain is that he died for it with the same courage he'd shown in battle. The campaign of 1644–45 remains militarily extraordinary. 6 major victories in 12 months against consistently superior forces. Tippermuir, Aberdeen, Inverlochy, Auldearn, Alford, Kilsyth, each demonstrated tactical brilliance. Even Fyvie, the closest to defeat, showed masterful defensive fighting. Only Philiphaugh represents clear defeat, and that came through surprise and overwhelming force rather than tactical failure in set-piece battle. But tactical victories don't win wars when strategic fundamentals are unfavorable. Montrose commanded brilliant tactics, but he couldn't solve the fundamental problems. Highland armies were temporary. Lowland support was unreliable. The Covenant controlled Scotland's economic and political resources, and Parliament was winning in England. No amount of battlefield brilliance could overcome those realities. The claim that James Graham, Marquis of Montrose, never lost a battle requires examination. Across his 1644–45 campaign, he commanded in 6 indisputable major victories: Tippermuir, Aberdeen, Inverlochy, Auldearn, Alford, and Kilsyth. The engagement at Fyvie was a fighting withdrawal rather than defeat. His outnumbered force held off Argyll for 3 days and extracted intact, achieving the tactical objective of preserving the army. Philiphaugh was catastrophic defeat, but Montrose personally escaped with cavalry, whilst the Irish infantry under MacColla bore the brunt of Leslie's assault. Military historians debate whether a battle where the commanding general successfully extracts himself counts as his defeat or his subordinates. By strictest definition, Montrose's personal command record shows no clear defeat in set-piece battle, where he held tactical control from beginning to end. But records matter less than understanding why he won so consistently. Montrose's tactical system combined 3 elements that his opponents couldn't counter effectively. First, he exploited terrain ruthlessly. Every battle except Philiphaugh occurred on ground Montrose had chosen or adapted to his advantage. At Tippermuir and Kilsyth, he used open ground that favoured the Highland charge. At Inverlochy and Alford, he used high ground and rivers to channel enemy attacks into killing zones. At Auldearn, he used terrain to hide his main force, whilst MacColla's detachment absorbed enemy attention. Second, he perfected combined arms integration before most British commanders understood the concept. Highland warriors provided shock assault capability, the devastating charge that broke enemy formations through speed and violence. MacColla's Irish infantry provided disciplined staying power, troops who could hold positions under fire, maintain formation during retreats, and anchor defensive lines whilst Highlanders manoeuvred. Cavalry, though always his weakest arm, screened movements and pursued broken enemies. Each component compensated for others' weaknesses. Highland charges worked because Irish infantry held the centre. Irish defensive positions succeeded because Highland flanking attacks prevented enemies from concentrating overwhelming force. This integration was sophisticated military practice in an era when most generals deployed arms separately. Third, Montrose understood tempo and timing with instinctive precision. At Auldearn, he waited whilst MacColla's 500 held off 4,000 until the perfect moment for flanking assault. At Kilsyth, he delayed attacking the exposed Covenant flank until their entire army was committed to the vulnerable manoeuvre. At Inverlochy, he marched through impassable mountains because doing the impossible faster than enemies anticipated created strategic surprise. Modern military theorists call this getting inside the enemy's decision cycle, acting faster than opponents can observe, orient, decide, and act. Montrose did it naturally. These tactical strengths made him extraordinarily dangerous in battle. But they couldn't solve strategic problems that transcended battlefield excellence. Highland warfare's fundamental limitation was that Highlanders went home. Clan warriors fought for plunder, glory, and feuds, not for sustained campaigning. After every victory, Montrose's army dissolved. He'd win battles with 5,000 troops, recruit back to 3,000, win again, and watch the army shrink to 1,500. This pattern repeated throughout the campaign. No general can win wars when his army disappears between battles. The lowland problem was equally insoluble. Scotland's population and wealth concentrated in the lowlands, Edinburgh, Glasgow, the agricultural regions of the south. Montrose won battles in the Highlands and northeast, but these regions couldn't support sustained royalist government. He needed lowland nobles to commit genuinely, bringing their tenants and resources. But lowland nobility viewed Montrose's Highland army as threatening barbarians, and Aberdeen's sack confirmed their prejudices. The very troops who made him tactically successful made him politically unacceptable to the people whose support he strategically required. Compare this to Oliver Cromwell's campaigns in England. Cromwell commanded the new model army. Professional soldiers who stayed with their regiments year-round, received regular pay, and maintained discipline between battles. Cromwell could win at Naseby in June 1645 and still command that same army months later. Montrose won at Kilsyth in August 1645 and by September commanded fragments. Cromwell operated from territory his side controlled politically. Montrose operated from bases that disappeared when his army did. Tactical genius cannot compensate for those structural disadvantages. Prince Rupert of the Rhine offers another instructive comparison. Rupert was Charles I's finest cavalry commander, tactically brilliant and personally courageous. He won spectacular victories through aggressive shock tactics similar to Montrose's Highland charges. But Rupert's strategic judgment was questionable. His decision to storm Bristol in 1645 arguably cost the Royalists their last major stronghold. Montrose showed better strategic instincts than Rupert, yet still failed because brilliance alone cannot overcome resource disparities. The what-if scenarios are tantalizing. If Montrose had marched south immediately after Kilsyth, instead of consolidating, could he have changed the English Civil War's outcome? Possibly, but probably not. His 10,000 troops in August would have shrunk to 3,000 during the march south. Those 3,000, exhausted from marching and without supply lines, would have faced Parliament's new model army, disciplined professionals who'd just destroyed the main Royalist field army at Naseby. Montrose might have won tactical victories, but he couldn't have reversed Parliament's strategic dominance of England. If Highlanders hadn't deserted, if lowland nobles had committed fully, if Charles I had sent money and weapons, if Parliament hadn't sent Leslie with veteran troops, every what-if requires changing the fundamental structural realities that determined the war's outcome. Montrose's campaign wasn't lost through his mistakes, but through conditions he couldn't control. That's not exonerating him. Strategic limitations are still limitations, but it explains why tactical excellence produced temporary victories rather than lasting success. Modern military establishments still study Montrose's campaigns. The Winter March to Inverlochy appears in Staff College curricula as example of audacious maneuver warfare. Auldearn's deception and holding action demonstrate principles of economy of force and tactical flexibility. Kilsyth shows how exploiting enemy mistakes produces decisive victories. His integration of irregular troops with conventional forces offers lessons for counterinsurgency and hybrid warfare. But the broader lesson is sobering. Winning battles isn't winning wars. Strategy requires sustainable resources, political legitimacy, and institutional support. Montrose possessed none permanently. His campaign demonstrates what tactical genius can achieve temporarily, and what it cannot achieve permanently. It's simultaneously a masterclass in battlefield excellence and a cautionary tale about mistaking tactical success for strategic victory. Was James Graham the greatest Scottish general in history? That's subjective and depends on criteria. For pure tactical brilliance across sustained campaigns, Montrose's 1644-45 record is unmatched in Scottish military history. For strategic impact and lasting consequences, figures like Archibald Douglas or even David Leslie achieved more. Montrose won more spectacular battles than any Scottish commander, but influenced Scotland's ultimate fate less than generals who won fewer battles but controlled resources and institutions. His execution in 1650 transformed him from failed commander into romantic martyr. Scottish poets celebrated the great Montrose, who fought impossible odds for doomed causes. Royalist propagandists made him a symbol of loyalty unto death. Covenant historians struggled to explain how their forces repeatedly lost to his smaller armies. His reputation grew larger in death than it had been in life, which is perhaps fitting for a man whose greatest victories came in battles everyone said he'd lose. The ultimate assessment must acknowledge both triumph and tragedy. Montrose commanded in 7 major engagements and arguably lost only one, Philiphaugh, through surprise rather than tactical failure. That's an extraordinary record. He defeated every Covenant general sent against him when he held tactical initiative. He destroyed armies with consistent brilliance. But he couldn't transform battlefield victories into political control, couldn't maintain armies between campaigns, and couldn't overcome the strategic realities that made royalist victory in Scotland ultimately impossible. Military history remembers him because his campaign represents something rare: tactical perfection against impossible odds, sustained across multiple battles, demonstrating principles that remain valid centuries later. We study Montrose not because he won the war, he lost, but because he showed what warfare's art looks like when practiced by a master. That's perhaps the only immortality generals can achieve, being remembered not for victories that changed history, but for demonstrating excellence that transcends their era's particular conflicts.